All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let's begin. So first of all, our learning this month is dedicated by Ayal and Sarah Steinberg in honor of the yard site of Ayal's mother, Ilya Daphna Bas Yosef. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, her neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. So let's begin. So today we have the great zchus to begin Maseches Zevachim. And first of all, Mazel Tov to everyone who completed Maseches Haryos yesterday. Really a beautiful and incredible way to end the Masech, an incredible Gemara yesterday. And the details for the Siyum and Meretz Hashem will be forthcoming, hopefully today or tomorrow. And we begin Maseches Zevachim. As I mentioned before, when we learn the sugyas of karbanos, so sometimes, because we haven't had them for 2,000 years, so we tend to tune out a little bit. But understand, when you learn the details of karbanos, one has the opportunity to fulfill the concept of unushama parim svasim. The same way that we recite karbanos every single morning, and through the recitation of those karbanos, it's almost as if one is offering up those karbanos. We learn the sugyas of karbanos as well. It's the same kiyum. Unushama parim svasim. Every single word that we say, every single word that we learn regarding karbanos, it's as if we have the opportunity to be makriv the karbanos. And to a certain degree, it's even greater. Because in the Beis HaMikdash stood, and you want to be makriv a karban, you can only be makriv a type of karban in which either you're obligated to, or if it's an optional karban that you have the ability to offer. When you learn, you can offer any and every karban all of the time. So in certain respects, the ability to be makriv karbanos through the medium of learning almost offers us greater carbonic opportunities than actually mamish going to the Beis HaMikdash itself. So at times when the Gemara might feel a little bit, very detail-oriented, and say to myself, I have absolutely no idea what's going on, but just understand that on a certain level, every single word that we learn of this particular Masechta, we have the opportunity to be makriv karbanos. And haludai natzachos, Kadosh Baruch Hu should see the love, not only that we have for His Torah, but the love that we have for His karbanos, and the zchus of us learning Maseches Zevachim. We should be zocheh before the end of this Masechta to stand together in the rebuilt Beis HaMikdash, to be able to be makriv our true karbanos with the Melech HaMashiach and Rabbi Ameinu. Amen. Kol HaZevachim. We'll say, let's begin. All karbanos. Shenizbechu shelo lishman. All karbanos that were offered up shelo lishman, not for their own sake. Now look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Kol HaZevachim shenizbechu shelo lishman, shenishchat ola l'shem shlamim. So Rashi gives a more extreme example, although we'll see other examples of this. But Rashi, in the sense, shelo lishman literally means I'm offering the carbon for a different type. So, for example, again, I was supposed to offer up an ola. An ola is a carbon that is totally consumed on the mizbeach. But instead, I had in mind that it should be l'shem shlamim. I had in mind that it should be for the sake of a shlamim. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Ksherim. The halacha is it's kosher. Now we're going to have to discuss what kosher means exactly. Kosher for what? Rashi says over here, ksherim lizrok daman or lahaktir emurehem v'le'achol es hane'acholin. So we'll say what we're going to see is ksherim means that the carbon can continue to be offered. In other words, even if I shechted it not for the intention of the particular carbon that it was supposed to be offered for, I have the ability to continue forward with the carbonic process. However, ella shalo alu lebailim l'shem chova. I will say rather, but the only caveat is that if I'm bringing this carbon to satisfy a particular obligation, if I shechted it shalo l'shman, then it does not satisfy that obligation. So, for example, as we will see, if I had the obligation to bring an ola, and I went ahead and instead offered it up as a shlamim, as much as the carbon itself is kosher. The carbon itself is kosher, meaning the carbon could be offered, but it does not satisfy my obligation, and I will have to bring another ola. Chutz min ha-pesach v'achatos, with the exception of the Pesach and the Chatas. I will say now, when we say with the exception of, that we're going to see these are karbanos that if they are not offered up to Shema, if they are not offered up for their intended purpose, then halacha l'maisa they are pasul. We will discuss in the Gemara later on, in really like 2 weeks or so. We'll discuss in the Gemara exactly what's unique about Pesach, what's unique about Chatos. But for our purposes now, here's what we have: every single carbon, even if offered up for a different intention, will still remain kosher, except that does not satisfy the obligation of the owner. So far, according to the Tanakama, with the exception of Pesach and Chatos. Ha-Pesach bismano. I will say, when do we say that a Pesach that is offered up for the intention of a different carbon ultimately is not kosher? That's only bismano. Look at Rashi. Ha-Pesach bismano. Pasal shelo lishmo. Kozman shchita. So dahinu mechatzos hayom shel erev Pesach ad ha'erev. Aval kodim lachin va'achar mikan Kaimalon de Pesach b'shayimos hashana shlama. So we'll say Rashi's giving us some details that Meretz Hashem we will learn later on in the Masechta. But for now, we're just going to go with the simple reading of the text. When do we say that a Karban Pesach that is offered up not for Pesach purposes, what we call Shalol Lishmo, is going to be possible? That's Dafka Bismano. That's Dafka on Erev Pesach from midday, from Chatzos and on. We will see that a Karban Pesach essentially is a shlamim offering, right? Because remember, again, there's a part that's offered up on the Mizbeach, there's a part that's for the Kohanim, there's a part that's for the owners. So, but Pesach Bismano that is not offered up to Shema is going to be possible. V'achatos b'chol zman. But a Karban Chatos, Rabbi said, that is not offered up as for the sake of a Chatos, but is offered up for something else, is going to be possible. Possible Gamre, as we'll discuss. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Af ha'asham. Rabbi Eliezer adds on to this, is supposed to say an asham as well. That if you have a Karban asham that is offered up for another purpose, meaning when we say another purpose, meaning it's offered up in mind for a different type of Karbanic offering, Rabbi Eliezer says that will also be possible. Ha-Pesach bismano v'achatas v'asham b'chol zman. And Rabbi Eliezer is adding on to the list. He says the Pesach, if offered up for the purpose of some other Karban, ultimately, again, on Erev Pesach will be possible. Chatos and an asham that are offered up for some other purpose will always be possible. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, "Hachatos ba'achet, va'asham ba'achet." A chatos, Rabbi says, is a sin offering. An asham is a sin offering. So we'll discuss again, when do you bring a chatos, when do you bring an asham? Machatos psula shalol lishma. Just like a chatos is possible, Rabbi say, if offered up. When we say again, shalol lishma means for the sake of another Karban. In other words, remember again, just to illustrate this. Achatos l'shma Rabosai means what? Means what? A chatos that is offered up for a chatos. A shalol l'shma means a chatos that's offered up, whatever, you fill in the blank. An asham, an ola, shlamim, Karban Pesach, whatever it is. So Rabbi Eliezer says, just like a chatos is pasal shalol l'shma, afa asham psula pasal shalol l'shma. So Rabbi Eliezer essentially will see makes a gzera shava, just as the chatos ultimately again comes for a sin, is going to be aser shalol, is going to be pasal shalol l'shma. So to an asham that comes to a chaper for chait, if it's offered up shalol l'shma, it'll also be pasal. Next, Yossi ben Choni Omer. Yossi ben Choni says as follows: Hanishchatin l'shem pesach or l'shem chatos psulin. So we'll say we're going to see exactly what it is that Yossi ben Choni is coming to add in over here. So Yossi ben Choni says that which is offered up l'shem Pesach or l'shem Chatos is possible. We'll see in the Gemara what Yossi ben Choni means. Shimon Achi Azariah Omer. Shimon, the brother of Azariah, says Shachtan. Let's supposed to say now. It's okay. So up until now, what we've done is as follows. We've created a principle. What's the principle? That karbanos, in an ideal sense, every karban is supposed to be offered up lishma, which means that if you're bringing a particular karban, you slaughter it and you perform all of the avodas for the sake of that particular karban. What we have learned is what? That if you offer up a karban shalol lishma, then what's the halacha? Right? I'll give you a hint. We learned it 4 minutes ago. Good morning, everyone. Right? So again, mamish, we just started Zevachim. You can't tune out yet. You got to give me like 2 days. Give me 2 days. So I'll say, remember again. So we discussed 4 minutes ago that if you offer up a karban shalol lishma, the karban is kosher, except it does not satisfy the personal obligation of the owner. So the owner has an obligation to bring a particular type of karban. If he offers it up shalol lishma, ultimately, the karban is kosher in that you could continue to offer it up on the Mizbeach, but it doesn't satisfy his personal obligation. Then the part 2 is, there are exceptions to that rule. What are the exceptions to that rule? It appears Karban Pesach is an exception to that rule. It appears that Chatos is an exception to that rule. And at least according to Rabbi Eliezer, it appears that Asham is also an exception to that rule. Okay, now part 3. Yossi ben Choni Omer. Shimon Achi Azariah Omer. So we'll say now we continue on in the discussion of Shalol Lishma. So we'll say if you go ahead and you shech the karban, what Shimon Achi Azariah says is l'shem gavoa. L'shem gavoa means if let's say we'll say I'm offering karban. Hey, now remember we have not yet gotten into the halacha, or I should say the framework of karbanos, kachei kadoshim, kachim kalim, higher sanctity offering, lower sanctity offerings. We're going to get into all of that now. Right now, we'll just deal with this on a very high level. So Shimon Achi Azariah says as follows: if you take a karban, shachtan l'shem gavoa mehen. We'll say if you take a karban and you shecht it shelo l'shma. But watch this. What's happening? What kind of shelo l'shma? You're shechting it with intention of a carbon that is of a higher sanctity. Then what's the halacha? Ksherin. The carbon is kosher. L'shem namuch mehen psulin. But if you shecht it shelo l'shma, and you have in mind that you're shechting the carbon for the intention of a carbon that is of lesser sanctity, then what? Then it's possible. Ketzad, for example, kadshe kadashim sheshachtim l'shem kadshim kalim. Well, say if you had a carbon that was kadshe kadashim, which is the highest sanctity, highest level of carbonic sanctity. So I had a kadshe kadashim carbon, but I shechted it l'shem kadshim kalim. I shechted it again for the sake of a lower sanctity carbon, then psulin. Kadshim kalim sheshachtim l'shem kadshe kadashim. But we'll say on the flip side, if I go ahead and what? If I go ahead and I take something that was kadshe kalim, and I go ahead and I shecht it for the sake of kadshe kadashim, higher sanctity carbonos, then ksherim. Then I will say that'll be kasher. I will say now one of the interesting things we're going to have to see is what the Tanna Kama holds regarding Shimon's position. Remember again, the Tanna Kama doesn't seem to. We'll see how to reconcile Shimon Achi Azariah Shita with the rest of the Mishnah. But for now, we'll say this seems to be a third part of the Mishnah that Shimon Achi Azariah says. Even when we say Shelo L'Shman is kosher, but Shelo Ol L'Shem Bailim, Shimon Achi Azariah says, if you're shechting it Shelo L'Shman for a higher sanctity, it's kosher. Shelo L'Shman for a lower sanctity, it will be possible. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Shlomim, Habachor Ba'amaiser, Sheshachton L'Shem Shlomim. So I will say again, this is just another example of Shimon Achi Azariah's principle. Bachor and Meiser. Sheshachton l'shem shlama. So we'll say bechor and meiser. Right, bechor is the firstborn animal. So meiser is meiser behema. So ultimately, again, if it was shechted l'shem shlamim, we'll say so. This is an example of taking a lower sanctity carbonic offering and having in mind a higher sanctity. Shlamim is higher than bechor and meiser. Then ksherim. Then ultimately, again, the carbon will be passer. Will be kosher. Excuse me. Shlamim sheshachton l'shem bechor or l'shem meiser. But if you take a shlamim offering, which is of a higher sanctity, and when you go ahead and you do the shlita, you have in mind for bechor or for meiser, ultimately, again, it will be possible. So we'll say, so this last case is just an example or just an illustration of Shimon Achi Azariah's principle. Good. So we'll say, so it says the Gemara, Lama li lemisna ela shelo alu. Lisna below alu lebailim l'shem chova. So we'll say, the Gemara now asks a syntax question. Remember again, how does the Mishnah start? The Mishnah begins with a statement. Anytime that you offer up a carbon, not for the sake of that particular carbon, it is kosher. But it does not count to satisfy its owner's obligation. Asks the Gemara, why do you write it rather instead write below alu lebailim? What do you mean, Ella Shelo Alu? Just right again, they're Ksherim, Vilo Alu, L'Shem Bailim. And they did not satisfy the owner's obligation. The Gemara is just asking a syntax question. Why do you have to write Ella Shelo? That word Ella just seems to be unnecessary. To which the Gemara says, oh, I'll tell you why. So the Gemara says, Hakamash Malan, Lebailim Hu Delo Alu, L'Shem Chova, Ava Bikdusha Saihu Kaimi. So we'll say what it does teach us is as follows. It tells us, the Ella teaches me that even though it does not go ahead and what? Does not count to satisfy the owner's obligation, the carbon still remains in its state of Kiddusha, v'aser l'shanuye behu. And it is prohibited to make any further changes in that carbon. We'll say, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's a second class Rashi, the first of the wide lines on the bottom. Aba bikdusha sayu kaimi, va'asr l'shanu yebehu, su shinuya achrina, la'avod achas mishara baldos lechatchila shelo l'shma. Miyuim avar b'shina kasha. We'll say what this means is as follows. I might have thought that once you deviated from what was supposed to be the normative designation of this carbon, once you've deviated, you could deviate as much as you want. To which the Gemara says, no. What the Mishnah is coming to teach me is as follows. Yes, it is true. If you offer up a carbon, not for the intended purpose of that carbon, so the carbon is still kosher. Ella shelo alu lebailim. Except the only change over here is that what? It does not satisfy the owner's obligation, but the carbon itself is still sacred, and one should not make any more deviations in the offering process of this carbon. In other words, one might have thought that once it deviated, you could deviate as much as you want. Kamash Malon, no. Even though you deviated, so now again, the carbon can't count towards the obligation of the owner, but the carbon still has its sanctity. And therefore, one should not make any more deviations than one already has. So the Gemara says, Rava says, Ola sheshachta shelo lishma. Well, say if an ola was shechted shelo lishma, meaning an ola was shechted for some other purpose other than an ola, aser lizrok dama shelo lishma. We'll say, so the halacha is, remember, once an ola is shechted shelo lishma, we'll say, then what happens? What happens? It becomes that carbon that it was shechted for. So let's say again, the ola was shechted l'shem nidava, for argument's sake, whatever it is. Hey, so we'll say, so therefore, what does that do? That goes in and transforms it into a nidava. And when you go out and you sprinkle the blood, you should have in mind to sprinkle the blood l'shem nidava. In other words, don't deviate anymore when the blood is being sprinkled. Also, lizrok dama shel lishma. In other words, once you've deviated, don't think that therefore you could deviate as much as you want. Rather, go ahead and maintain the same kavanas for the rest of the zrikas as well. So we'll say, Damarava, let's just read that once more. Damarava, Ola sheshachta shelo lishma, that if an Ola was shechted not for its own sake, Aser lizrok dama shelo lishma. We'll say, just because the Ola was shechted shelo lishma does not mean the other avodas should be done shelo lishma as well. Rather, those should be done lishma. We'll say, let me clarify this. See, I might have thought that once you've deviated with the carbon, so kind of do whatever you want. Kamash Malon, no. Even if you've deviated, so now what you've done is, also when you deviate, what do you effectively do? Again, we're gonna see this in the Gemara. You effectively end up repurposing the carbon. Once you end up repurposing the carbon is still kosher. But just understand, once you've repurposed, then stay the course. And then make sure ultimately, again, that the subsequent avodos are done for the same purpose as well. That's the idea that the Gemara is coming to teach me. So the Gemara says, where do we know this from? Iba yisem svara, iba yisem ekra. One possibility is I learned this out from a svara logic. Other possibility is a pasuk. Iba yisem svara. So if you want to say that it's a svara, mishum dishani ba kol hani lishtim bavalezel. So the svara is just because you deviated once, should you continue to deviate? In other words, we're saying, so the idea over here is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, one would have thought that once you've deviated, you can kind of do whatever you want. Kamash no, just because you made one deviation does not mean that automatically a person should continue to go ahead and do more deviations as well. See, even if I've gone ahead and I've deviated, even if I've gone ahead and halacha l'maisa changed the intention or changed the kavana of the carbon, one should not continue to deviate forward. Rather, one should ultimately stay the course. What's the other possibility? Is a pasuk. What's the other possibility? Motzas vasecha tishmar vasisa kasher adat l'Hashem elokech. So understand over here, the incredible chiddush that the Gemara is teaching us about is as follows. Chiddush number one is that if you offer up a carbon shelo lishma, then what? What's the chiddush number one? Is that it's kosher. Chiddush number two is that what? It transforms into that new carbon that I had intention for. Chiddush number three, which is really not such a chiddush anymore, is stay the course. Stay the carbonic course. So I was supposed to offer up whatever it is, a shlamim, and then instead I had in mind for an ola. Fine, stay the course for the ola. Now stay the course. The carbon is kosher. The carbon is good. It doesn't satisfy my obligation, but stay the course. Do not deviate anymore. So where does the Gemara live? So Makra pasuk, motzas vasecha tishmar va'asisa kasher nadarta l'Hashem elokech anadava. So the pasuk says, motzas vasecha tishmar. That which you have promised, you should keep. That's what you have promised. Ultimately, again, you should adhere to. Va'asisa kasher nadarta. You should do as you pledged to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'Hashem elokecha nidava. A nidava. So Gemara says, I don't understand. Hi nidava. Why does the pasuk end off nidava? Amud beis nederhu. So you understand the inherent contradiction in the pasuk. The pasuk begins by saying, Motzos vasecha tishmar. If you vowed something to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you should keep it, right? Kasisi kasher nadarta. If you made a neder, you should uphold the neder. Nedava, right? Kasher nadar shalokech nedava. Supposed to say, which one is it? The pasuk is talking about a neder, Well, as we're going to see, there's just a neder offering and a nedava offering. The pasuk says, if you promise to bring a neder offering to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, follow through. And if you follow through, how should you follow through? By nedava. I don't understand. If it's a neder, it's not a nedava. If it's a nedava, it's not a neder. The pasuk is telling me that if I made a neder to bring a carbon, follow through. Why did it bring in nedava? To which the Gemara said, well, so listen to this. Ella im kamash nadarta asisa yehi neder. If ultimately again, im kamash nadarta asisa, if you've done as you pledged, right? Then ultimately again, follow through. V'imlo nedava yehi. So I'll say, watch this. So the Gemara says as follows. If you promised to bring a neder and you follow through, your kavanos was for a neder, everything, fantastic, bring your neder. But if for some reason you've deviated and you had in mind that your neder should what? Be in a dava, then what? Follow through on that. Stay the course. Meaning even after you've shifted, follow through. Look at Rashi just a moment. Nederhu, Daha Kasher Nadar Taksiv, V'yesh Chiluk Bein Neder L'Nedava. Neder Damar Harei Alai L'Nedava. We'll see this. We'll say, Im Kamash Nadar Tasisa, Sha'avad Avod Uvdose Lishma. So we'll say, if I had in mind to bring a neder, and I'm doing the avodas l'shem neder, fantastic. Then great, stay the course. However, im lav yehei l'nedava ki ilu hisnadavta lazen nedava acheres v'lo l'shem harishon. So we'll say, hear what's happening over here. What the Gemara is saying is as follows: the pasuk is talking about someone who began this carbonic journey. Right? We're all on a carbonic journey together. He began this carbonic journey by ultimately saying, "I'm going to bring a neder." Okay, so fantastic. If your journey begins with a neder and you offer it up as a neder, shalom aleichem, everything's fantastic. But if for some reason over the course of your journey, that which was supposed to be a neder you had in mind for a nedava, and when you shechted it, you had in mind for a nedava, then what, Rabbi say? Then what? Follow through. Then follow through. If you changed already and you changed it to a nedava, follow through. The one issue that you may have to deal with later on is what? That you probably did not satisfy your obligation. That we'll discuss. That's separate. But what it's teaching me is that once you've deviated, stay the course of the deviation. Follow through on the carbon the way you started this, the way you started this carbon offering. And was certainly again, once it's in a dava, then halacha l'maisa, you're not permitted to deviate from it. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi, so now once it's in a davar, I will say, one is not permitted to deviate anymore. In other words, once but the Gemara is saying is as follows. Again, I will say it's a very simple principle. I made a thought that once I deviated, I have a license to deviate back to what the carbon was supposed to be. Kamashmal on what? Kamashmal on no. Once you've deviated, then that's the course you stay on. So it's supposed to be a neder. Then at the time of shechit, I mind for a nedava, I deviated. So what does the Torah teach me? Stay the course of the nedava. Stay the course of the nedava. Which, by the way, we understand an incredible mussar in this as well, which is the need to stay the course in life. Sometimes, again, we make mistakes. Sometimes you get on the wrong path. So we'll say sometimes you have to change courses, but sometimes you just have to stay the path and continue forward. You made a mistake with your carbon, it's fine. Finish out this carbon in accordance with your deviation. You may have to bring another one to satisfy your obligation, but no flip-flopping. No carbonic flip-flopping over here. So we'll say, the Gemara goes weiter. So now what we have is as follows. What we have is what the Mishnah is coming to teach Rabbi say is like this. There are really two principles over here. Number one, that if I was supposed to offer, I was offering up a carbon and I was supposed to offer it up for A, whatever A is. And at the time of the shechita, I had a mind for B. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Carbon is kosher. Again, we'll deal with the fact that if that carbon was supposed to satisfy an obligation, I didn't satisfy my obligation, but the carbon is kosher. But what's the next chiddush of the Mishnah? Don't flip-flop. Which means if you checked it, the shame B, then what? Stay the course of B. Finish out the avodas of the carbon for the sake of B. How do we know that? Either svara, just because he changed once, they'll keep changing, or pasuk. Good. So what's in Avaiter? So listen to this. Amrli Ravina Rapapa. So Ravina said to Rapapa, Lo havis kaban ba'arta. You are not. Well, let me read the rest of the phrase. Lo havis kaban ba'arta betchuma beicharmach derami rava mili ma'al yasa ahadadi b'shanilu. So let's listen to this. So Ravina says to Rapapa, you really missed out. You were not with us, right? You were not with us the other evening in the tchum of Beicharmach. Beicharmach is a place where Rava Rava was, that Rava said some incredible things because he brought up some contradictions and he resolved them. So Rava said, these are the kind of friends you have to find in life. The kind of friends who give you a shtuch. Boy, did you miss a night out with the guys last night, right? We were at the Tchum of Beichamach, and Rava Mamish was reconciling prices like nobody's business. And you mamish, you missed it. I'm so sorry you missed it. But it was an incredible evening. Well, these are the kind of chaverim we have to have. So these are the kind of nights out we have to have also. But okay, so it says the Gemara. My mini mal yasa. So we'll say, what is it that Rava was contrasting, and what are the reconciliations that he brought up that were so amazing? We'll also listen to this. Tanan. So we'll listen to this. So what he quoted over here. So the first thing that Rava quoted was our Mishnah. Which means all karbanos. So we'll say that were offered up shelo l'shman. So remember again, our Mishnah says, this is just go from our Mishnah, ksherim, right? The halacha is that they're kosher. So we'll say, so what do we see from this Mishnah? Time of the shelo l'shman. So the reason ultimately, again, we'll say the Mishnah says two things. Number one is that halacha l'maisa, the carbon is kosher, but shelo alu l'shem bailim. They do not satisfy the obligation of the particular owner. Now, what Rava inferred from this is as follows. Taima d'shelo l'shman. The reason that the karban mentioned by the Mishnah does not satisfy the owner's obligation is why? Because it was being offered up shelo l'shman. Meaning it was like, it was actively being offered up for another purpose. Hastama alu nami l'baylim l'shem chova. Rava say, but what can you infer from here? What you could infer from Rava says, what happens if when the owner offered up the karban, he had no kavanas? He just checked the end. He didn't have in mind for anything. Obviously, he has in mind that it's a karban, but he has absolutely no das what type of karban it is. So I'll say, what do you see from here? It sounds like from based on the Mishnah that if the owner offered up the karban, what we call stama means with no particular intention, nami alu lebaylim l'shem chova. It would satisfy the owner's obligation. Rabbi say, now remember again, where is that deal coming from? Because the Mishnah's case, Rabbi say, is what? Kol Zevachim shenizbechu shelo lishman. Rabbi say, remember again, what does shelo lishman means? What does shelo lishman mean? For something else. Shelo lishman means I have active das for something else. That Rabbi says that's when it doesn't count towards the owner's obligation because he actively has in mind for something else. But what we can infer from this is if it was stam das means I have das for nothing. Rabbi say a lot of people go through entire life like this, right? I have stam das for nothing, right? I don't have das for A, I don't have das for B, I have stam das. It sounds like in that case, not only is the karban kosher, but what? It also counts towards the obligation of the owner. So that's diuk number one. Almost stam nami kilishman dami. So also we see from here, we can be medayek from here that stam, no das, is the equivalent of lishma or mini. I will say that Rava contrast. This is amazing. Kalaget shenechtav shelo l'shem isha puzzle. I will say, what do we learn? That any get that was not written for a particular woman. In other words, I will say this goes back to the lishma din of gittin. That if a get was not written expressly lishma for a particular woman, puzzle ustama nami puzzle. I will say, so what do you see from gittin? Let's say again, somebody just wrote stamaget. So obviously, if a get was written shelo l'shem isha, so shelo l'shem isha means, the get was actively written for another woman. It was actively written for Rachel, right? Or it was actually, it was actively written for Rachel A. So Rachel B can't use it. Okay, because Lamaisa, again, it was actually written for someone else. Ustamanami pasal. I will say ultimately again, but you can infer from that is as follows. The Mishnah over here says, Gola get shnichtav shelo l'shem isha means that the get is only kosher if what? If it's expressly written for the particular woman in question. Ustamanami pasal. So we see from here that gittin, that a stam das, which means like a parav das, does not work. So which one is it? From Karbanos, it sounds like that what? Stam das, right? In other words, is good, works. Because it sounds like from the Mishnah again about that as long as they don't have active das for another carbon, stam das will allow the carbon to count towards my obligation. Yet by gittin we see that stam das doesn't work. So which one is it? Bishani, Rava resolved this. Zevachim bistam lishman omdin. Rava said this is amazing. So Rava said, when it comes to Kavanas Avosai. So Zvachim Bistam Lishmanom. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Stama Lishmanom. Then Hilchach Kol Kamadalo Akar Shemayu Padihab Lishman. Remember the way a carbon works. Is that a person either said this animal is a carbon, or a person said, I have an obligation, I obligate myself to bring a carbon, or circumstantially is an obligation to bring a carbon. So we'll say, by carbonos, the way it works is, it's lishma until you ruin it. In other words, we'll say that by carbonos itself, and this, by the way, this makes sense, because the only time a person brings a carbon abosai is how? Is either A, if circumstantially is obligated, or B, if he obligates himself. So the idea is that even if at the time of the shechita, I don't have any express intent, the carbon itself is lishma. And the only time that lishma of the carbon is ruined is when Rabbi was saying, is when I actively uproot it by having kavana for a different type of carbon. However, isha b'stam alav legerishin omedes. Rabbi say a stam woman is not omedes legerishin. Right? A stam woman is not in the parsha of gerushin. A stam woman is in the parsha of being a married woman. So in order to go ahead and then put her in the parsha of gerushin, there has to be expressed das for the purpose of gerushin. So it's like, this is actually quite amazing, because what it's saying over here essentially is that once you get into the carbonic framework, by definition, you are considered to be lishma until you do something to actively override that. But as long as you do not do something to actively override that or change that, the original circumstantial kavana still remain in place. Uzvachim b'stomach she'nabos saying that this, by the way, is going to be very important, because this is going to dictate how kavana works in general with kavanas. So now what you're telling me is that zvachim b'stomach she'nabos, which also means that by kavanos, as long as I don't have the wrong mindset, then what? Then by definition, we assume that the carbon is kosher. So that's what it means. Zvachim b'stomach she'rid. That as long as I don't have erroneous mindset, the assumption is that the carbon is being offered for the right kavanas. So where do we know that from? Uzvachim b'stomach she'rid minalan ilim mehadislan. Maybe you'll say it from the following. Kol azvachim shnizbachu shelo lishman. So let's remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said all karbanos that are offered up shelo lishman. Rabbi say, now what does it mean when a carbon is being offered up shelo lishman? Rabbi say, what does that mean? So remember again, Rashi already said, what did it mean? Where I have active kavana for something else. It was supposed to be a shlamim, and I have actively in mind for an ola. So the fact that the Mishnah chooses to say kol azvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman tells me that the only way to get myself in trouble is to actively have in mind for something else. For lo katani shelo nizbechu lishman. And both sides, it doesn't say that zvachim shelo nizbechu lishman. See, both sides, you hear the difference between that? The difference is kol azvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman versus kol azvachim shelo nizbechu lishman. Both sides means two different things. Shelo nizbechu lishman. Both sides, tell me that what? That in order for a carbon to be kosher, what do you have to have? Express intent lishma. Shenizbechu shelo lishman tells me that the only thing that ruins this is when I have active kavana for something else. But as long as I didn't have active kavana for something else, I'm good. So here's the problem with that. Gabegat nami haktani, but here's the problem. By get, it also says, kalaget shenechtav shelo l'shem ish apostle. Well, say by get, it also says, any get that was written, shelo l'shem isha. Below katani, shelo nichtav l'shem ish apostle. So here's the problem with this diuk. We know again, if that's the case, that you can make the same diuk by gin. That as long as the get wasn't written shelo l'shem isha acheres, that's going to be good enough. But yeah, we know by get that's not the case. By get, most of the only way it works is how? Is if the get is actively being written for that particular woman. So that diuk doesn't work. Elameha. Rather, you can learn it from this diuk. Remember again, we're trying to figure out by karbanos that stam das is good. That by karbanos, I will say, even if I don't have express intention, active, we'll call it express positive, active intention for the carbon being offered. As long as I don't have kavana for something else, the carbon is going to be kosher. Where do we know that from? Elameha, this nan keita lishman, v'shelo lishman. So again, we'll see the Mishnah says, what's the case of lishman and shelo lishman? L'shem pesach or l'shem shlamim. Tama do amar l'shem pesach or l'shem shlamim. So the reason ultimately, again, what's the case? Shelo lishma, where a person actively says l'shem pesach or l'shem shlamim, ha l'shem pesach ustama kosher. Almost staman kilishman dami. So we'll say, so again, take a look at Rashi over here. L'shem Pesach or l'shem shlam. So we'll say the case over here is where a person has in mind in the beginning of the carbon l'shem Pesach, and at the end of the carbon, and at the end of the process l'shem shlamim. So Rashi says here, Haloshem Pesach Ustama, Shalochishev Acharav L'Shem Shlam Kasher, Afagav Disov Shchita Stama Ishchit. So we'll say, you can infer from here as follows. If a person has in mind, again, we're going to see this case later on, so we're not going to delve too deeply into it right now, but for our purposes right now, this is a case where at the beginning of the carbon, a person has in mind that it's L'Shem Pesach, and then at the end of the carbonic process, he has in mind, or some part later on in the carbonic process, he has in mind it's L'Shem Shlavim. So he actively has in mind something different. That's where the carbon is problematic. But if he had in mind in the beginning of L'Shem Pesach and doesn't have in mind anything specific later on in the carbonic process, the carbon will be kosher. So you see from here that what? Stama kilishman dami. That Rabbi say again, stam intent is the equivalent of having intent lishma. To which the Gemara says maybe not. Dilma shiny hasa. Maybe that case is different. Why? The Amar Kala Osa al Das Rishona Osa. So you will say, because maybe you'll say in that case that as long as you begin the carbon for the proper intention, even if you deviate later on, we don't care about that so much. As long as you began with the proper intention, that's what matters most. Elam is seifa. So we'll say, so maybe therefore, even in that case where I started out L'Shem Pesach, even if I have stam intent later on, I will say, that stam intent doesn't undermine the carbon in any way. Why? Because I began for the right purpose. Elam is seifa. So the Gemara says, we learn from the seifa. Shelo lishman ulishman. What's the case of shelo lishman and lishman? L'shem shlamim u'l'shem pesach. So we'll say, let's say I shechted my carbon pesach, and at first I had intention for shlamim, but then at the end of the process, I have in mind for pesach. So taimudam l'shem shlamim u'l'shem pesach. The reason why the carbon is problematic is because in the beginning I had in mind for l'shem shlamim and then l'shem pesach. Hastama u'l'shem pesach kosher. I will say if I shechted the carbon for no particular purpose and had in mind for what carbon pesach later on in the process, it would be kosher. I will say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that stam das by carbonos works. To which the Gemara says no. Dilma shiny hasam the amar yochiach sofo al tchilaso. Maybe that case is different, Rabbi Say, because since in the end they had in mind for carbon pesach, what we say is sofo mochiach al tchilaso. Let the end of the carbonic process shed light on the beginning of the carbonic process. Just like the end is L'Shem Pesach, so to the beginning is L'Shem Pesach. Inami, Aidi detana lishman b'shlo lishman, tananami shlo lishman lishman. What's the other possibility is the Mishnah doesn't mean to have you be medayik in that second case. Rather, again, it was just only bringing down that second case for the sake of Mishnaic symmetry. Elameha. Rather, we'll say it's from here. So let's remember again, just so we keep the eye on the ball. What are we trying to prove? What the Gemara espoused was a very important carbonic principle, which is what? That stam das is proper das by carbonos. Which also means what? That what we'll call pariv das by carbonos is absolutely carbonically fine. That as long as by carbonos, as long as you don't have erroneous das, the carbon is going to be perfectly. Let me see differently. We'll say. The Havamina was, I might have thought that in order for a carbon to be kosher, what do you need? Specific das for the carbon being offered. Now what we're saying about say is that no, in order for the carbon to be kosher, both procedurally as well as to count for the owner's obligation, all I need is what? Or all I need to avoid is wrong das. So if I need to offer up an ola, I don't even have to have in mind that it's an ola. I just can't have in mind that what? That is a shlam, that is something else. But as long as I have stam das for the carbon, which means I'm just shechting it with nothing specific in mind. When I say nothing specific in mind, I will say one thing is clear, which is why I have to have in mind that what? That it's a carbon. That's a carbon. But that's really the only das I have to have. And as long as I don't have das for the wrong carbon, then not only is the carbon kosher, also, but what else? It fulfills my obligation. So it says we're going to learn after Rabbi say this is actually amazing, and with this we're going to conclude. So the Gemara says Elameha l'shem shisha dvarim hazevach nizbach. So listen to this, and we're going to see this later on. This we're going to see Mem Vav Amud Beis 46b. We're going to see this. It's going to go by quickly. So again, when you go ahead and you offer up a carbon, you have to have in mind six things. L'shem shisha dvarim hazevach nizbach. Number one, l'shem zevach. you have to have in mind that you're offering it up for the purpose of a carbon. L'shem zaveach, you have to have in mind that you're offering it up, again, for the sake of the person for whom it is being offered. Rashi says where l'shem zaveach is, she is kaper bo bailov, b'sholosh is kaper bo acher. We'll say, so we'll discuss who has these intentions. Has to be offered up, on behalf of the particular individual. L'shem shame, that I'm offering you this up for the Ribbon Shalom. L'shem ishim, for the sake of the fires. Rashi says, L'shem ishim laktirim v'lo la'asosim tzli ala mizbeach. The goal is that I'm offering up this as a carbon and not as a barbecue. L'shem reach, for the sake of creating an aroma. Okay, well, again, the Gemara is going to discuss all of this. L'shem nichoach, that it has to be a pleasing aroma for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As Rashi says, L'shem hanochas ruach LaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'shamar v'nasa esono, v'achatos v'asham l'shem chet. And when offering up a chatos and an asham, it has to be offered up for what? For ultimately, again, for the sake of a sin offering. Amar Rabbi Yossi, af mi shelo haya b'libo l'shem achas mikol elu kasher. Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, no, even if you didn't have in mind, right, these kavanas, your carbon is still kosher. Your carbon is still kosher. Look at Rashi just a moment. Shelo haya b'libo l'shmo elastam. Below hisker echamel. Most Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, yes, l'chatchila, you should have these 6 things in mind. But even if you didn't have these 6 things in mind, nevertheless, what? Your carbon is kosher. Let's say, get ready. This is wild. This is wild. Why? So you understand what just happened over here? It's like it's overwhelming. The Gemara just tells me I have to have in mind 6 things when I offer up a carbon. Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, what? No, you don't. No, you don't. Right? Even if you didn't have in mind any one of these 6 things, right? Your carbon is still kosher. So even before we go on, Rabbi Yossi essentially is teaching us is that what? Even if you offered up a carbon, what? Stam. The carbon is still going to kosher. We'll say, obviously, again, there has to be some level of basic kavanah, which is that you're offering up a carbon. But as long as you had in mind that you are offering up a carbon, even if you didn't have in mind these 6 things, ultimately, again, the carbon is going to be kosher. Why? Shetnai bezdinu. Because I will say, again, this is a Tanai Bezdin. Rashi says, Shetnai Bezdin means Bezdin legislated this. Look at Rashi. Shetnai Bezdinu, Sheyishchatu stam, v'lo yaskiru b'shchitasam l'shmok. The first time, so let's listen to this. Bezdin actually legislated that you don't have to have in mind lishma. Why? So the Gemara says, Shetnai Bezdinu, Asnu Bezdin de l'olema lishmo, Dilma asi l'meimer shelo lishma. Both say, so Bezdin actually legislated that when offering up a carbon, we're going to delve into this more, that when offering up a carbon, Yedafko should not say that the carbon is being offered up lishmo. Why? Because what are Bezdin concerned about? Bezdin are concerned that somebody may make a mistake and what? Say that it's being offered up shelo lishmo. Now, I will say, now, to actively articulate that a carbon is being offered up shelo lishmo could cause a whole other host of problems. Therefore, Bezdin said, we're going to keep it easy. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. When you bring your carbon, just bring your carbon. Now, if you want to say that a carbon that's offered up stam, without any intention other than it's a carbon, if you want to say that such a carbon is really possible, kaimi Bezdin umasni milsa the mifsabe, could Bezdin go ahead and legislate something ultimately again that is possible? So we'll say, so we see the fact that Bezdin comes along and said that when you offer up your carbon, you don't actively have to say anything. Now, you don't have to say anything. I will say, now the reason Bezdin legislated that is because Bezdin were afraid that what? That you were going to say the wrong thing. So therefore, Bezdin said, you know what? Don't say anything. Bezdin could only make that legislation if what? If stam carbon is possible. If a stam das by a carbon, I will say, stam das is kosher. Right? I will say, if stam das by a carbon is possible, so Bezdin could not legislate such a thing. It's only because we say that stam das by carbon is possible. I'm sorry. I'm just getting phone calls over here in the middle. And so it's only because ultimately we say that stam das by carbonos is kosher, that Bezdin has the ability to legislate and say what? Don't say anything when offering up your carbon. Don't say anything. Which, by the way, another musar. Sometimes in life, the best approach is don't say anything. Because again, one thing is clear. When you don't say anything, one thing is sure, which is what? Not going to say the wrong thing. Right? Bezdin knew what they're talking about. So again, with Kavanos also, there's a lot more you could mess up by talking. than not talking. So don't say anything. And ultimately, again, the carbon will be kosher. But again, this legislation only works if halacha l'maisa. If halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, we say that stam das is kosher. So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to pick up with the get. Let's follow with the get piece. So we'll say what comes out is as follows. So let's just review what we've got. Number one, that when you offer up a carbon shalol lishmo, then halacha l'maisa, again, the carbon is kosher, but it doesn't necessarily count towards the obligation of the bailim. That's number one. Number two, what we've seen is once you deviate and you offer up that carbon shalol lishmo, then what? Stay the course. Stay the course. Continue offering up the carbon for that particular deviation. Right? That's number one. That's number two. Number three is that halacha. What was number three? Number three is that stam das by karbanos is going to be kosher. So say even if halacha l'maisa, again, a carbon is not offered up. So again, let me say differently. In order for a carbon ultimately to encounter some type of carbonic problems, one would have to actively offer it up for the sake of something else. That's when the carbon is still kosher, but not necessarily misachis to the bailim. But if a carbon is offered up with stam das, or it's just for the sake of a carbon, even without what we'll call specific das for which type of carbon, not only is the carbon kosher, but we'll see ultimately again it could count towards the obligation of the owners. Also, stop over, pick up here in Yatz Hashem tomorrow. Just to remind you, tomorrow is also Rosh Chodesh. Daf begins in Yatz Hashem at 5:45 tomorrow.